Picture this: you wake up tomorrow, and every compliment you've ever received, every moment you were praised, admired, liked, celebrated suddenly disappears. It's not that people hate you, it's that they don't care. You're invisible. No one's watching. No one's clapping. No one's validating your existence. Now ask yourself, would you still do what you do? Would you still chase the goals you chase? Would you still post, perform, achieve, strive, hustle, if there were no eyes on you? If the answer is even slightly no, then you've just uncovered the hidden puppeteer behind much of your life, the ego. And Nietzsche saw it coming. Long before social media, before likes and followers, before hustle culture and curated brands of the self, Nietzsche warned us, the ego is not your identity. It's your cage, and unless you confront it, it will rule you and ruin you. In this video, we're diving deep into the philosophical abyss of the ego, guided by the seismic insights of Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who dared to ask the questions most people run from. But this isn't self-help fluff. This is existential warfare. Because your ego isn't just a little voice in your head whispering arrogance, it's the architect of your suffering, the master illusionist that convinces you that you are what others think of you, that your value is tied to image, that your life is a performance on a stage built by strangers. And if you don't expose that lie, you'll spend your entire existence chasing shadows, enslaved by a self that was never real to begin with.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Let's begin with a classic Nietzschean idea. The ego is a fiction created by language. You heard that right. Nietzsche argued that the I we refer to the self we protect, promote, and perform is not some eternal soul or core identity. It's a grammatical trick, a convenient fiction. I think we say, as if there's a separate I behind the thought. But Nietzsche flips the script. What if thinking just happens? What if the self is not the origin, but an echo? What if your ego is simply a narrative stitched together after the fact to give coherence to chaos, meaning to randomness, identity to a stream of instincts? Now, that's a terrifying idea, because it means that who we think we are might be nothing more than a story we've told ourselves over and over until we believed it. And that story? It's usually built from ego. We say, I'm a kind person, I'm a success, I'm better than that. But each of these claims is a fortress, a defense, a mask. The ego doesn't want truth. It wants certainty. It wants to be right, admired, safe, superior. And to maintain that illusion, it will lie, deflect, blame, and attack. Nietzsche called this the will to power, the fundamental drive, not just to survive, but to dominate, to assert one's self-image, to impose meaning where there might be none. But here's the twist. The ego doesn't empower you. It enslaves you. Because the moment your identity is built on image, you become a prisoner of perception. You're no longer free to be, to fail, to change. You become addicted to your own reflection. And what is more tragic than a person who can't live authentically because they're too busy performing a role? Let me ask you something hard. When was the last time you did something purely for its own sake, not for praise, not for recognition, but not even for self-esteem, but because it was right, or true, or beautiful? That's the ego test, because the ego always wants something back. It doesn't give freely, it calculates, it competes, it compares, And in doing so, it creates the illusion of separateness, me versus you, winner versus loser, powerful versus weak. But Nietzsche challenges this binary. He says, true strength is not dominance. It's self-overcoming. Not conquering others, but conquering the false self, the mask, the ego. This is where his concept of the Übermensch, or overman, comes in. It's one of the most misunderstood ideas in philosophy. People think Nietzsche was talking about a superior race or a superhuman. He wasn't. Ente. The Übermensch is someone who transcends the ego, who creates their own values, who lives not for approval or conformity, but from an inner source of authenticity. The Übermensch doesn't obey inherited norms. They don't chase status. They don't pretend. They become who they are, even if it means being misunderstood, rejected, or alone. But how do you become that person in a world like ours? A world that monetizes your ego, that profits off your insecurity, that rewards performance over presence. First, you have to see the ego for what it is, an adaptation, not a truth. It developed to help you survive social systems, to navigate tribes, hierarchies, reputations. But what helped you survive is not always what helps you live. And the ego, left unchecked, becomes a parasite. It feeds on validation. It craves control. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. And that's why it's your worst enemy. Because the most beautiful things in life, love, art, growth, wonder, require vulnerability. They require not knowing, not winning, not being in control. Have you ever noticed how the ego reacts when you're criticized? It flares up. It defends. It denies. It lashes out. Why? Because criticism threatens the story. It threatens the image. And the ego will do anything to protect its illusion, even if it means sabotaging your relationships, your peace, your growth. Nietzsche would say, let it die. Let the story fall apart. Let the image crack. Because on the other side of ego death is something more real than any identity you've ever performed, freedom. But don't get it twisted. Ego death isn't a one-time event. It's a practice, a discipline, a choice. Every day you're faced with moments where you can choose ego or truth, praise or purpose, comfort or growth. And each of those choices shapes your soul. Let's bring this down to earth. Think about how many decisions in your life were made by your ego. The job you took to impress others. The relationship you stayed in to avoid being alone. The risks you didn't take because failure would bruise your image. These aren't just missed opportunities. They're missed lives. Lives you could have lived if you weren't trying so hard to be someone. This is why Nietzsche said, become who you are, not who your ego wants to be, not who others expect you to be, but who you are beneath the mask, beyond the performance. That's not just self-discovery, that's self-creation, because identity isn't found, it's forged. And the furnace is your willingness to lose the false self. So, what does it look like to live without ego? It doesn't mean becoming passive or invisible. It means acting without needing applause, loving without needing possession, creating without needing validation. It means doing what is yours to do, even if no one gets it. Even if it scares you, even if your ego screams in protest. Ask yourself this: what would I do if I wasn't afraid of not being liked, That question might just change your life. Because the ego feeds on fear of rejection, failure, insignificance. But your deeper self, it's fearless. Not because it's invincible, but because it's real. It doesn't need to pretend. It doesn't need to win. It just needs to live. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The ego has no why, only a how: look good, feel superior, stay safe. But your soul has a why. And when you find it, when you live from it, the ego begins to shrink. Not because it's defeated, but because it's no longer needed. So here's the challenge: starve your ego, feed your soul. Do something today that your ego hates but your truth loves. Apologize. Admit you were wrong. Ask a dumb question. Say no. Say yes. Be real. Every time you do, you chip away at the illusion. And what's left is not emptiness, it's you. Let's imagine something wild for a moment. You wake up tomorrow and your ego is gone, not suppressed, not temporarily silenced, but completely dissolved. All of the defensive walls, all the compulsive self-comparisons, the hunger for validation, the need to be better than right, admired, or seen, they're just gone. What's left? At first, probably chaos, because the ego, for all its illusions, gave you structure. It gave you identity, even if it was a cage. It gave you a reason to get out of bed, even if that reason was to one-up someone, win at something, or avoid shame. And without it, there's a terrifying void. But pause right there, because that void, that's not emptiness, that's possibility. That's life unfiltered. That's reality without distortion. And Nietzsche understood this better than anyone. He didn't call for ego death just to make you humble. No, he called for it so that you could see clearly. Because once the mirror of ego shatters, you no longer see a reflection, you see the world as it is. And here's the shocking part: the moment your ego dies, the world around you begins to rebuild, not because the world itself changes, but because your relationship to it does. Suddenly, every person you meet is no longer a threat to your image, a competitor in the social arena, or a tool to boost your self-worth. They're just another soul, as lost, as complex, as radiant as you. And that realization, when it hits you in your bones, is the beginning of genuine love, not the kind that flatters the ego, but the kind that transcends it. Now, let's get brutally honest. Most of us spend our lives in invisible wars, battles for superiority, for control, for recognition. We do it in careers, in relationships, even in moments of supposed vulnerability. We share our pain online, but deep down we want applause for being honest. We give advice, but secretly we want to be seen as wise. We meditate and work on ourselves, but often it's to become a better version of the self we still desperately protect. That's the ego's genius. It can disguise itself as progress, as humility, even as enlightenment. But Nietzsche warns, beware of the ego in spiritual clothing. Because the most dangerous ego is not loud and arrogant, it's subtle and righteous. It convinces you that you're better because you've transcended. But real transcendence leaves no trace of superiority. It's not a badge, it's a surrender. So what actually happens when we begin to live ego-free, not perfectly, but intentionally? One of the first things that changes is your understanding of power. The ego sees power as domination, being on top, being the best, being untouchable. But without ego, power becomes something entirely different. It becomes presence, the ability to inhabit your own being fully without needing to prove anything. You walk into a room and you're not trying to impress or hide. You're just there, fully. That kind of presence is magnetic because it's rare. And it's rare because most people are still living through the lens of performance. But when you stop performing, something miraculous happens. You give others permission to stop performing too. That's how the world begins to rebuild, one moment of authenticity at a time. It's not loud, it's not flashy, it's not viral, but it's real. And in a world drowning in simulation, realness is revolutionary. Let me ask you this: what would your relationships look like if you didn't need to win? If you didn't need to always be right, admired, or in control? Most of the suffering in relationships, romantic, platonic, familial, comes not from genuine conflict, but from ego collisions. Someone feels disrespected, someone feels unseen, someone's pride gets bruised, and instead of truth, we choose ego armor. We withhold affection, we play games, we seek revenge, we justify cruelty, and all of it is ego. But imagine a world where you could say, "You hurt me," without needing to punish. A world where you could apologize without fearing that it makes you weak. A world where you could love without needing to be needed. That's not utopia. That's what happens when ego dies. And it starts with you. Nietzsche knew that the death of ego doesn't just change the self, it changes society. Because ego is the root of hierarchies, of war, of oppression. Every dictator is an insecure man with a fragile ego. Every corrupt system is built to protect egos at the top. Every ideology that dehumanizes others is a projection of egoic fear. But when the ego dissolves, you no longer need to dominate. You no longer need to be superior. You no longer need to create enemies to feel righteous. And that's when justice becomes possible. Not performative justice, not justice as brand, but real justice born from the understanding that we are not separate, not better, not above, but that we are fragments of the same mystery, trying to remember who we are beneath the masks. This is why Nietzsche didn't just critique the individual ego, he critiqued the ego of civilization. He saw how religions, nations, and ideologies create collective egos. We are the chosen. We are the best. We are right. And those collective egos always lead to violence. Because when a group believes its identity is superior, it will always find a reason to crush the other. Nietzsche's solution wasn't nihilism, it was reinvention. He wanted us to tear down false selves so we could build new ones grounded in truth, not tradition, not borrowed values, not inherited fear, but freely chosen meaning. That's the task, not just to deconstruct but to create, and to become the author of your own values, not because it's trendy or rebellious, but because it's necessary. Otherwise, you're just living out someone else's script, someone else's ego. So here's the ultimate question. What would it take for you to create a life that ego has no power in? Not just in theory, practically. What would you need to let go of? Whose approval? Which identity? What toxic ambition? What illusion of control? And what would you gain in return? Maybe, for the first time, peace. Not the peace of winning, or being praised, or being admired, but the peace of being real, being here, no mask, no performance, you're just you. Nietzsche believed that the path to this kind of freedom was brutal but worth it. Because the only way to truly live is to become who you are, not who your ego wants to be. And to do that, you must be willing to destroy the mirror. Not to become empty, but to become whole. Because when the ego dies, the truth doesn't disappear, it emerges. And in that emergence, you don't just find yourself. You find the entire world waiting to meet you again for the first time. God is dead. These three words are some of the most misunderstood, misquoted, and misused in all of philosophy. When Nietzsche wrote them, he wasn't celebrating atheism like some modern slogan. He was mourning something far deeper, the collapse of meaning. You see, for centuries, humanity had built its identity, its morality, its very sense of purpose around ideas of God, order, and absolute truth. These were the anchors, the scaffolding, the compass. And when Nietzsche declared their death, he wasn't just talking about religion. He was talking about the death of certainty, the death of the old ego, the death of the self that relied on external validation from deities, from doctrines, from cultures. And in that death, he saw both a terrifying abyss and a radical opportunity, the chance to become truly alive. But let's not romanticize it too much. The ego doesn't go quietly. It clings. It seduces. It insists that without it, we are nothing. That without our roles, our labels, our carefully curated personas, we'll fall apart. And in a sense, it's right, because ego death is a kind of death. It's the death of the false self, the death of the narrative you've repeated so long you forgot it was optional, the death of the voice in your head that says, I must be more, I must win, I must be known. So yes, when God dies, so do you, the version of you that was built on borrowed beliefs, inherited fear, and the desperate need to be someone. But what Nietzsche offers is not despair, it's rebirth. Because once the scaffolding falls, you're free to build something new. Not out of obligation, but out of creation. Not to please others, but to become who you are. So what does that even mean, to become who you are? It's a paradox, isn't it? How can you become something you already are? Because the truth is, most of us have never met our real selves. We've only met our egos. And our egos are composites made of past experiences, cultural scripts, parental expectations, trauma responses, and the algorithms of social approval. But beneath all that noise is something quieter, more subtle, something that doesn't need to be explained, only experienced. And to reach it, you don't climb higher, you go deeper. You don't add more, you remove. You unlearn. You strip away layer after layer of egoic illusion until what's left is raw, unfiltered, unbranded. And you, contour, you. But here's the kicker: Nietzsche understood that most philosophers didn't. This process is terrifying. Because when the ego dies, so does your sense of control. And humans hate not being in control. We would rather cling to a painful identity than step into the unknown. We would rather be a failure than a mystery. We would rather be someone than no one. But Nietzsche says, you must become no one before you can become everything. You must pass through the fire of meaninglessness, of chaos, of ego death, because only then can you create values not handed to you, but born within you. Let me ask you this: if nothing outside of you could define you, not your job, not your followers, not your family, not even your name, who would you be? Most people can't answer that, not because they're unintelligent, but because they've never been invited to ask. We are conditioned to define ourselves by externals: what we do, what we own, what we post, what we achieve. But Nietzsche dares us to go inward, to sit in the silence, to ask not who should I be, but what am I choosing to become? That's the shift. That's the moment the ego dies and the self begins. And this isn't just abstract philosophy, but this has real, practical implications. When you operate without ego, your entire experience of life transforms. You stop comparing yourself to others because you realize there is no better, only different. You stop chasing empty goals because you see they were never yours to begin with. You stop lying to yourself because the truth, no matter how painful, is finally something you're strong enough to face. And that strength doesn't come from ego. It comes from soul, from the part of you that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Imagine how different your life would be if you weren't constantly trying to prove something, but if you didn't need to be right, or liked, or perfect. If you could just exist for real. That's not laziness. That's not apathy. That's power. Because when the ego dies, you no longer live in reaction, you live in creation. And from that space, you begin to author your own life. Not with borrowed words or recycled dreams, but with your own voice, your own rhythm, your own truth. This is where Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch becomes so important again, not as a superhuman, but as a human who has transcended the herd. He's a person who doesn't need validation to act, who doesn't need tradition to believe, who doesn't need applause to speak truth. The Übermensch is not above others, they are beyond ego. And that makes them dangerous not to people, but to systems, because systems rely on the ego. Capitalism thrives on your insecurity. Politics thrives on your identity. Religion, when corrupted, thrives on your obedience. But a person without ego, they can't be manipulated. They can't be sold a lie. They can't be bought with praise or silenced with shame. They are free. And freedom, real freedom, is the most revolutionary force in the world. So how do we get there? How do we kill the ego without losing ourselves? The answer is as brutal as it is beautiful. We must be willing to die before we die. Not physically, existentially. We must let go of who we think we are. We must allow our illusions to collapse. We must confront our emptiness, not to escape it, but to embrace it. Because that emptiness is not a void. It's a womb, a place of creation, a beginning disguised as an end. And when we rise from that place, when we rebuild from that nothingness, we emerge not with answers, but with presence. Not with certainty, but with clarity. Not with ego, but with essence. And in that state, we don't just live, we awaken. We don't just succeed, we serve. We don't just exist, we become. Nietzsche's message has been twisted for generations. I miss to do. People think he was promoting selfishness or nihilism. But the truth is, he was promoting a radical kind of selfhood, a self born from fire, not fantasy. A self forged through ego death, not ego inflation. A self that doesn't need to be worshipped, followed, or liked. A self that simply is untamed, unafraid, and utterly alive. So, I'll leave you with this. What are you willing to let die so that you can finally live? Not someday, not in theory, but now, but in this moment. Because the ego is clever. It will always whisper, tomorrow. But life is not tomorrow. It's this breath, this choice, this act of courage to say, I am not who I pretend to be. I am not who others expect me to be. I am who I choose to become. And today I choose freedom.